I watched my grandfather's handcrafted home transform into a neon green eyesore and crumble under emergency renovations, while my HOA president Karen smugly directed the destruction, thinking she'd finally won our war. Little did she know I'm the CEO of the region's largest employer with power to destroy everything she built and send her to prison. How far would she push me before I revealed my true identity? Comment below where you're watching from. The morning started like any other with me sipping coffee on my grandfather's handcrafted cedar deck, watching the sunrise cast golden rays over our craftsman-style home. My grandfather had built every inch of this house with his own hands after returning from World War II, using rare old-growth cedar that couldn't be replaced at any price. That's when I spotted her, Karen Williams Power, walking toward my driveway with a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands like it contained state secrets. I'd seen that during the neighborhood meetings she'd started hosting at her newly renovated McMansion across the street. I felt my stomach tighten as she stopped to take photos of my front yard with her phone. My grandfather's native plant garden was in full bloom, the same plants he'd carefully cataloged and nurtured for 50 years. Their natural beauty stood in stark contrast to Karen's perfectly trimmed exotic ornamentals. I knew she hated every indigenous plant. The clipboard contained what she called an exciting neighborhood beautification initiative, a formal notice about mandatory exterior color schemes, complete with a glossy brochure showing identical beige houses with matching landscapes. The compliance deadline was 2 weeks with a $10,000 beautification contribution for anyone refusing to participate. But that wasn't what made my hands shake. It was the pre-approved contractor list attached. Replace my stained cedar with vinyl siding. Remove the hand-carved porch posts that had welcomed family for generations. And tear out the native garden that provided habitat for local wildlife and had been featured twice in sustainable gardening magazines. The most devastating requirement: removing the historic cedar beams my grandfather had salvaged from an old forest fire. Beams that couldn't be found anywhere else in the country. I watched Karen through my window as she walked back across the street, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, I just delivered the final notice. He'll have to comply now. His house is the last holdout on the block. Her voice carried that fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. Once we get his property in line with standards, our kickback from the contractors will double, and that developer can finally make his offer on the whole block. That evening, I walked to Karen's house, notice in hand. Her doorbell played a tinkling version of "We Are the Champions." Of course it did. She answered wearing a neighborhood association president pin, lips stretched in what I guess she thought was a welcoming smile. "I've reviewed your beautification initiative," I said calmly, my years of corporate negotiation experience keeping my voice steady. "I need to decline. This house was built by my grandfather himself after returning from war. These materials can't be replaced, and I intend to preserve his legacy." Her smile vanished faster than donuts at a morning meeting. "You don't understand," she said, leaning forward. "This isn't really a request. The HOA has already contracted the painters and renovation crew. Your property is surrounded by compliant members. You have to participate." I pulled out the property documents I'd researched that afternoon. "Actually, that's incorrect. My deed predates any HOA agreements, and I have no legal obligation to participate. Furthermore, the native plant garden is protected under the state's conservation easement program. 20 years of executive experience had taught me to always do my homework." Karen's fake shade of red. "Listen here," she hissed, dropping the fake niceness. "This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult. Permit issues arise. Water lines break. Electrical systems malfunction. Houses even catch fire sometimes when wiring is outdated." I met her gaze steadily. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Williams?" She stepped back, sugary smile returning. "Of course not. I'm just concerned about your safety and community standing. Old-fashioned homes like yours can be so dangerous. It would be terrible if something happened because you refuse to modernize." Behind her, I could see her husband watching through their window, phone in hand. Something about his stance made me uneasy. I nodded politely and turned to leave. But Karen's voice stopped me. 3 days, she called after me. "You have 3 days to reconsider before the contractors start work, whether you agree or not. Accidents happen to houses that don't meet code." Walking home, I noticed new faces watching from their windows. Karen's HOA allies, no doubt. Something told me this wasn't going to end with a simple declined notice. I spent that night installing security cameras around my property, making sure to document its current condition. I'd learned long ago to trust my instincts, and right now they were screaming that Karen Williams was just getting started. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't just about property aesthetics or native plants. In my 3 decades of dealing with difficult people, I'd never encountered someone like Karen. As I fell asleep in my grandfather's hand-carved bed frame that had survived 2 generations, I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a war that would change everything, and that my beloved family home would become its first battlefield. But Karen had made one crucial mistake in choosing her target. She just didn't know. The morning started with Karen's shrill voice outside my window. "The color palette has been approved by the entire board. This is what modern neighborhoods require." I peeked through my curtains to find her leading a group of painters and construction workers toward my home, carrying buckets of the most offensive neon green paint I'd ever seen, and, more alarmingly, demolition equipment. My heart sank as I watched them set up ladders against my grandfather's meticulously crafted siding and begin unloading sledgehammers near my historic porch columns. I tried to enjoy my morning coffee on the deck, but their whispers carried across the yard. "Did you see those weird native plants? They're not HOA approved. And those cedar posts so outdated. Shame if they couldn't support the roof anymore." Every day brought new violations, each more ridiculous than the last. They started leaving warning notices, bright orange papers taped to my door about regulations that didn't exist before their HOA. My Habitat-certified garden, which had been featured in sustainability magazines, was suddenly a neighborhood nuisance. The handcrafted porch swing, where 3 generations of my family had spent summer evenings, became their biggest target. One Tuesday morning, I found Karen measuring my walkway with a tape measure. 38 inches, she announced triumphantly to her sidekick Barbara, who furiously scribbled in a notebook. "That's 2 inches wider than regulation, and those foundation posts look unstable." I walked out calmly, coffee in hand. "You're trespassing on private property," I stated firmly, knowing my legal rights, but keeping my profession private. Karen just smirked and took more photos. "We're documenting safety hazards. Those support beams look like they could fail any day." The harassment got creative. They'd schedule landscaping crews to show up at 6:30 a.m., sharp on weekends, their equipment conveniently loudest near my home office window. Anonymous complaints to code enforcement became weekly events. Each time I calmly showed the officials my property's historical documentation, watching Karen fume from across the street. They tried psychological warfare next. Karen organized HOA meetings in her front yard right across from my home. I'd hear them discussing how certain homeowners were bringing down the neighborhood's reputation, how stubborn houses needed to be dealt with for everyone's good. My security cameras caught them testing my patience. They'd accidentally activate their irrigation systems when I walked past, then act shocked when I showed them the footage. "Oh, my state-of-the-art sprinkler system would never malfunction," Karen would gasp while adjusting her designer sunglasses as I stood there dripping wet. The breaking point came during their annual block party. I wasn't invited, of course, but I could hear Karen loudly discussing plans to revitalize the neighborhood. "Some outdated announced, glancing at my house. Just don't fit our community vision anymore. Between us, that eyesore might have some electrical issues soon. Just a prediction." That's when I noticed people taking photos of my home's electrical meter and gas lines, whispering about safety concerns and potential hazards. I stayed calm, documenting everything, each notice, every photo, all the anonymous complaints. I filed them methodically. When they installed bright security lights aimed at my windows, I added light pollution to my growing evidence file. My grandfather taught me patience before he passed, and as I watched Karen's group grow bolder, I knew timing would be everything. That night, reviewing my security footage, I caught something disturbing. 2 HOA board members were examining my property's electrical meter and main water line, whispering about outdated systems and fire risks. I recognized that, look, they were planning something bigger. But what they didn't know was that I'd spent my career dealing with people who thought they were above accountability. As I turned off my porch light that evening, watching Karen's group huddle in her driveway, I wondered how long I should wait before showing them exactly who they were messing with. I never expected to wake to the sound of demolition equipment at 5 a.m., but there they were, Karen directing a crew of workers who were already tearing down my grandfather's hand-carved porch columns while others slapped neon green paint across my cedar siding. My heart stopped when I saw part of my roof had already been removed, with rain clouds gathering ominously overhead. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted, phone already recording. Karen jumped but quickly regained her composure, that fake smile spreading across her face like poison. "Oh, we're just implementing the approved emergency safety renovations," she said sweetly, directing the workers to continue. "Our inspector found critical structural issues that posed an immediate danger. The HOA has strict rules about resident safety. If you'd just joined us properly, we could have handled this through the correct channels." I walked closer, blood boiling but voice steady. "That's not an approved renovation. That's criminal destruction of property. This is a historically significant home with architectural elements that can't be replaced." The workers shifted uncomfortably, but Karen stood her ground. "Well, our safety expert," she gestured to her husband, "determined this structure was in imminent danger of collapse, and these hideous natural wood elements are incompatible with our modern aesthetic guidelines. On my private property, behind my legally established boundary," I challenged, switching on my outdoor lights to better document the damage. That's when Mark, Karen's husband, emerged from their SUV parked at the curb. As a regional manager at Westbrook Construction, he thought he could intimidate anyone. Now, let's not throw around accusations. We're just trying to prevent a tragedy. Nobody wants to see a family hurt when this place inevitably collapses." He pointed to my partially demolished roof. "Those beams were rotting. We're saving your life." I noticed Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor 2 doors down, peeking through her curtains. She'd been bullied into replacing her traditional garden with Karen's approved generic shrubs last month after similar early morning visits. Her beautiful koi pond had been filled in with concrete within days. By afternoon, my house was a disaster. Half-painted neon green, the porch partially demolished, and a gaping hole in my roof just as the rain began to fall. Water poured into my grandfather's study, damaging irreplaceable family photos and the journals he'd kept while building this house. But Karen had made a crucial mistake. She'd unknowingly revealed the HOA's pattern of targeting homeowners with historical properties. I spent my lunch break at the county records office, discovering that every house that initially refused to comply with the HOA had experienced mysterious accidents, structural emergencies, or electrical fires until they sold or complied. 5 houses had burned down completely in the past year alone, all historic properties that stood in the way of a massive development plan. I installed high-definition security cameras that evening, hiding them carefully among my remaining untouched exterior features. That evening, Karen paraded potential contractors past my property. "Of course, this eyesore will be fully updated soon," she announced loudly. "We have ways of handling difficult residents. Once the water damage becomes severe enough, the city will condemn it." The following week brought an endless stream of harassment. My mailbox was destroyed 3 times. Anonymous complaints were filed about noise on days I wasn't even home. Code enforcement officers appeared daily, finding nothing but returning anyway. The rain continued damaged roof, creating thousands in water damage each day. I documented everything meticulously, building my case quietly, but Karen's group grew bolder. They started hosting HOA meetings on the sidewalk in front of my home, pointing out every perceived flaw to potential new residents. "This property is driving down home values," Karen would declare, waving her designer tablet for emphasis. "But don't worry, it won't be a problem much longer. We've seen how quickly these old places can burn down when electrical systems fail." The final straw came when I caught them tampering with my electrical panel, carefully loosening connections while pretending to inspect the sidewalk. My security cameras caught Karen instructing her minions. "Make it look like an accident, just like the Henderson place last year. Once these wires short-circuit, he'll have no choice but to sell. That'll clear the way for Phase 3 of the development plan." That night, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed something strange. The HOA's inspection team always included someone taking photos of my workplace parking pass, my company logo on deliveries, and my professional certifications visible through the windows. They were methodically documenting every aspect of my professional life. But why? The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they formed sent a chill down my spine. I knew I needed to act fast, but I couldn't reveal my hand too soon. What I didn't know then was that Karen had already set in motion a plan that would change everything. A plan that would bring all my worst fears blazingly to life. My hands trembled as I held up the morning report reading the shareholder updates on how I just approved a major new corporate campus that would employ thousands locally. The boardroom was dead silent when my assistant Miguel burst through the doors, his face ghost white. "Sir, your house. There's been a fire and the remaining structure has been painted neon green." Those words made my blood run cold. I threw my presentation notes aside and raced down the corporate steps, my heart pounding against my chest. 15 minutes, that's all it took to drive home, but it felt like forever. I could see the fluorescent glow and smoke from 2 blocks away, and my stomach turned to ice. Half of my grandfather's lovingly built home was now charred ruins, while the remaining structure was covered in that hideous neon green paint that hurt the eyes. As I screeched to a halt in front of my partially destroyed home, firefighters were battling a blaze that had consumed my grandfather's study and the east wing of the house. The heat hit me like a wall, and I could hear the ancient wooden beams, irreplaceable cedar my grandfather had hand-selected, groaning under the assault of flames. Everything my family had built over 2 generations was disappearing before my eyes. Through tears of rage, I spotted Karen standing in her driveway in her designer workout gear, sipping overpriced protein shake like she was watching a morning show. Her perfectly styled blonde hair gleamed in the sunlight as she chatted with other HOA board members. They weren't even trying to hide their satisfaction, whispering and pointing at different parts of my now burning home. Fire Chief Martinez approached me, his face grim. "Sir, it looks like an electrical fire. These old houses, their wiring can be dangerous." But I knew better. Just yesterday, I'd had my annual electrical inspection. Everything was up to code, just like always. I'd made sure of it after Karen's threats about unsafe historic properties at the last town meeting. My security cameras. The thought hit me like lightning. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I tried to access the footage. The screen was blank. Cameras had mysteriously stopped recording at 2 a.m., exactly 4 hours before the fire started. This was no coincidence. As I watched part of my home burn and the rest stand defaced in neon green, memories flashed through my mind, learning woodworking in that study with Grandpa, celebrating my MBA graduation in the garden, my first day as CEO, all now overshadowed by this devastating act, because I wouldn't bow to Karen's demands to join her precious HOA. Through the crowd of onlookers, I spotted 2 familiar faces, Bob Johnson and Mike Peters, both HOA board members, trying to blend in with the growing crowd of neighbors. But their clothes caught my eye, the same distinctive company uniforms I'd seen on my security footage last week when my electrical panel was tampered with. Now they were speckled with what looked like fresh soot and paint splatters. Karen strutted over, her face a mask of fake concern. "Oh, this is just terrible. If only you joined our HOA, we have such strict electrical safety requirements. But you were so stubborn about keeping things natural and historic." She emphasized the words like they were dirty, taking another slow sip of her protein shake. "Looks like that development company will finally be able to make an offer on this lot. I hear they pay premium for corner properties." I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. Not yet. I couldn't reveal my hand yet. Instead, I watched as she pulled out her phone, quickly typing something. Moments later, I overheard another neighbor talking about a fantastic deal on distressed properties that had just been listed in some exclusive real estate group. The firefighters finally got the blaze under control, but it was too late. My grandfather's hand-carved study was completely destroyed, the heirloom furniture reduced to ash. The roof had partially collapsed, and the neon green paint on the remaining structure was bubbling from the heat. A lifetime of family history destroyed in just hours. As I stood there watching the smoke rise, I made a decision. Karen thought she'd won, she'd broken me, but she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls, one to my company's head of security, one to my contact at the FBI, and one to a private investigator I trusted. I caught Karen watching me make those calls, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for just a moment. She didn't know who I was calling, but something in my determined stance must have worried her. Good. Let her worry. Because while my house stood partially burned and defaced in neon green, my real power had nothing to do with property and everything to do with justice and economic influence. As the sun rose higher in the sky, I picked up a small cedar chip, charred on one end and covered in green paint on the other. Grandpa had always told me that sometimes you have to lose something precious to gain the strength to fight back. Looking at Karen's smug face one last time, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. But first, I had to understand just how deep this HOA's corruption really went. Standing in front of my partially burned fluorescent green home, I made a promise that turned my devastation into purpose. While Karen paraded around the neighborhood spreading rumors that my outdated wiring had caused the fire, I was quietly pulling threads that would unravel her entire empire. My first breakthrough came when my old MBA classmate, now an FBI forensic accountant, discovered something disturbing. Every house that mysteriously burned down in our county over the past 3 years was insured by the same company where Karen's sister worked as a claims adjuster. The properties were then purchased by shell companies, all leading back to a major development corporation. I felt my hands shake as I dug deeper into building permits, each page revealing a pattern too perfect to be coincidence. I hired a private investigator who interviewed former neighbors who'd been forced out after similar accidents. Their stories matched mine exactly. Join the HOA or face harassment, followed by mysterious property damage, electrical fires, or structural emergencies. Most had given up and sold their homes for pennies on the dollar to Karen's investment partners. One elderly couple broke down crying as they described losing their family photographs and heirlooms in an electrical fire the day after refusing to paint their historic craftsman home beige. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Karen's former HOA treasurer, who reached out through my investigator. Over coffee at a quiet diner 2 towns over, she handed me a USB drive with 3 years of HOA financial records, her hands trembling as she explained how Karen had forced her to falsify documents, threatening to expose her past bankruptcy if she refused. The documents showed hundreds of thousands in kickbacks from contractors after each emergency renovation and mysterious cash deposits into Karen's personal accounts after each fire. Most damning were emails between Karen and a major developer discussing their accelerated acquisition timeline and how to expedite resident turnover through emergency measures. I spent sleepless nights connecting the dots. Karen's husband hadn't just worked at Westbrook Construction, he'd been their fire safety inspector, responsible for certifying all local buildings. Every house that mysteriously caught fire had been inspected by him days before the blaze, with no issues found on the reports. My security cameras had caught more than just the painters and demolition crew. They'd recorded weekly meetings at Karen's house with real estate developers, all salivating over plans to build a luxury resort where our distinctive homes once stood. One developer bragged about bribing city officials to change zoning laws once enough properties had been cleared. I discovered Karen's pattern: target homes in prime locations, especially unique properties that added character to the neighborhood or had historical significance. She'd use HOA rules to harass owners, then escalate to vandalism and emergency renovations if that didn't work. When all else failed, mysterious electrical fires would follow, conveniently destroying properties that stood in the way of the development plan. Working late one night, I found the smoking gun in old insurance records. Karen and her husband had done this before. 3 other historic neighborhoods in nearby counties had suffered the same fate. They'd move in, form an HOA, drive out resistant homeowners through escalating tactics culminating in fires, then sell the consolidated properties to developers for millions. They'd even won community leadership awards for neighborhood revitalization. The evidence was damning, but I needed more. I convinced the former treasurer to wear a wire to a meeting with Karen. The recording captured everything. Karen bragging about their next targets, joking about which houses might have electrical problems next, and threatening to make the treasurer disappear if she ever talked. Most shocking was her casual mention of how they'd taken care of a homeowner in another neighborhood who had gathered evidence against them. His car brake lines mysteriously failed on a mountain road. Each day I watched Karen strut around the neighborhood planning her next move while I secretly built my case. She had no idea that every smug wave, every fake sympathetic comment about my unfortunate fire was being documented. Her confidence would be her downfall. The final piece fell into place when I discovered why they targeted my house specifically. Hidden in the city development files was a confidential proposal showing a planned luxury resort complex. Karen's developer partners had inside information. My property was key to their plan because it sat at the entrance to the proposed resort. They'd already bought surrounding parcels through shell companies, but my house was the linchpin. Without it, their entire multi-million-dollar project would fail. As I organized the evidence for the FBI, Karen's desperation grew. She filed daily complaints about my eyesore property now half-burned in neon green. She even had the nerve to propose a special HOA assessment for fire risk mitigation, money that would go straight to her husband's inspection company. Little did she know every move she made only strengthened my case. I stood outside the community center, my heart pounding as I watched Karen strut through the entrance, carrying her signature protein shake and a stack of glossy folders. Tonight's HOA meeting would be different. After 6 months of careful planning, I'd finally show her who she'd been messing with all this time. Through the window, I could see her setting up her PowerPoint presentation, probably filled with more fake violation photos and made-up rules. My hands trembled slightly as I touched the company ID badge in my pocket. The weight of the FBI wire under my blazer reminded me that everything had to be perfect. The property at 247 Oakwood Drive has been declared a hazardous structure. Karen's voice boomed through the room as I quietly opened the door. As per our emergency powers, we'll be moving forward with immediate demolition plans. Our development partner has generously offered to purchase the lot for redevelopment. A chorus of confused murmurs filled the room. My neighbors, the decent ones who'd been too scared to stand up to her, shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. Any objections? Karen smirked, scanning the room with her beady eyes. No? Well then, let me show you our exciting plans for. I object, Mrs. Williams. My voice cut through the tension like a knife. Every head turned toward the entrance. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. Karen's smirk flickered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. Well, come to finally admit defeat? Your burned-out neon monstrosity is quite the eyesore. We're doing you a favor, really. She took a long sip from her shake, that same smug smile she wore while watching my house burn. I reached into my briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. Actually, I'm here to present some evidence of my own. I opened the folder, spreading photographs across the table. These security camera stills show you and your board members tampering with my electrical panel the night before the fire. Interesting timing, don't you think? Karen's face twitched. Those could be anyone, and besides, you can't prove. Oh, but I can. I pulled out more documents, bank records showing payments to her shell company after each house fire, emails discussing their plan to force out non-members, insurance claims handled by her sister, and my personal favorite, her text messages about making sure the electrical fire looked accidental, while her team painted the remaining structure neon green for maximum humiliation. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Karen's hands started shaking, protein shakes sloshing over the rim of her bottle. This is ridiculous. You can't just come in here with these wild accusations. I'll sue you for defamation. That was my cue. I reached back into my briefcase one final time, putting on my company ID badge. James Anderson, CEO of Meridian Enterprises, I announced, watching the blood drain from Karen's face. Currently employing over 5,000 people in this region, including, I paused, letting the moment land, the entire executive team at Westbrook Construction, your husband's company, which my firm acquired last month. Her protein shake slipped from her fingers, splattering across the floor. The pink liquid splashed across her designer shoes, but she didn't even notice. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. FBI, nobody move. On cue, agents burst through both doors, badges raised. Karen's husband, who had buried all those inspection reports, tried to make a break for the emergency exit. He didn't make it 3 steps before being tackled. I walked up to Karen, who had collapsed into her precious president's chair. You know what the biggest mistake arsonists make? They get so caught up in their own power trips they forget to check who they're really dealing with. I picked up her fallen gavel, the one she'd used to sentence my home to destruction. Meeting adjourned. The click of handcuffs echoed through the room as FBI agents led Karen and her board members away. My neighbors erupted in applause. Years of fear and intimidation finally broken. As I packed up my evidence, old Mr. Johnson from across the street hugged me with tears in his eyes. We should have helped you fight them, he whispered. I hugged him back, watching Karen being escorted to a waiting FBI vehicle. Sometimes, I said quietly, justice needs to take the long road to make sure it arrives at the right destination. The morning of the federal trial felt different. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror in my temporary apartment, straightening my tie, thinking about how Karen had laughed when my house burned. Now she wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and victims from other neighborhoods who'd come forward after seeing our story on the national news. Karen walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her usual athleisure wear, but her face turned ghost white when she saw me sitting in the front row. I'll never forget how she grabbed her lawyer's arm and whispered, "That's him, the one whose house we burned." Her lawyer dropped his pen. The evidence we presented was shocking. Our investigation had uncovered 15 other houses that mysteriously burned down after refusing to join Karen's HOA. The pattern was always the same: harassment, vandalism, then fire. They'd collect insurance money through her sister's position, then buy the burned properties for pennies through shell companies. They'd already made millions and destroyed countless family legacies. We played the security footage from my hidden cameras. The whole courtroom gasped, watching Karen and her HOA friends tampering with my electrical panel at 2 a.m. then later directing painters to cover the remaining structure in neon green paint after the fire. Karen kept shaking her head, mouthing no as her own voice came through the speakers. Once it burns, he'll have to sell like all the others. The real surprise came when Karen's husband, the former safety inspector, turned against her. He'd been keeping quiet out of loyalty, but seeing the evidence broke him. He told everything. How they planned it all. How they picked their targets. How they arranged for the fires and made them look accidental. Karen screamed, "Liar!" so loud the judge had to threaten her with contempt. One by one, people stood up to tell their stories. Mrs. Chen, the retired teacher who lost her family heirlooms. The Patels, whose cultural artifacts were destroyed. Each story made Karen shrink smaller in her seat. Her orange jumpsuit couldn't hide how scared she was now. When the judge read the verdict, my heart swelled with vindication. Guilty on all counts of racketeering, fraud, arson, and conspiracy. 25 years for Karen, 15 for her husband, and substantial sentences for each board member involved. Karen tried to give a speech about how she was just trying to improve the neighborhood, but the judge cut her off the same way she'd cut off my explanations about my grandfather's craftsmanship. That was 1 year ago. Today, I'm watching construction crews put the finishing touches on my rebuilt home. Using my grandfather's original plans and what materials we could salvage, they've recreated his vision. The cedar beams we couldn't replace have been honored with a special memorial garden, where his study once stood. Karen's house was sold to pay victim restitution. A lovely multi-generational family lives there now, their children playing in the yard where Karen used to stand taking photos of violations. The neighbors created a real community association, not an HOA, but a group that actually helps each other. We established a legal defense fund for homeowners facing similar situations nationwide. We have community gatherings in my rebuilt garden. Everyone brings food and shares stories of their own family legacies. Yesterday, Mrs. Chen brought her famous dumplings and showed me photographs of her newly restored traditional garden. Sometimes when I'm working in my garden, people stop to thank me, not for being a CEO, but for standing up to criminals who prey on homeowners. The national news did a follow-up story about how we transformed from the neighborhood terrorized by HOA arson into a community that protects historical legacies. They interviewed the Patels, who now host our monthly heritage preservation meetings in their beautiful restored courtyard. I keep a charred piece of my grandfather's hand-carved banister on my desk at the office, recovered from the ashes of my home. It reminds me that corporate power should be used responsibly, and that family legacies are worth fighting for. And every morning, I sip my coffee on my rebuilt porch, watching the sunrise through new windows crafted to match my grandfather's original design, knowing that sometimes the best revenge isn't just rebuilding what was destroyed, it's making sure the people who destroyed it can never harm another family again.